The People's Platform.
Good evening and welcome to the People's Platform. My guest tonight is V.V. Ganeshananthan, American writer of Sri Lankan Tamil descent. Her second book, Brotherless Night, was recently released to critical acclaim. Good evening and welcome.
Thank you so much for having me.
Let's talk about your second book, Brotherless Night, which had its global release in June of last year. It's a beautiful portrayal, a painful book to read, heart-wrenching, gut-wrenching portrayal of the period, starting with the period before the conflict in Sri Lanka. You say that you've been working on the book for 18 years, almost 2 decades before you finished writing it. My first question to you is, take us through that process, firstly from a research perspective and also from the perspective of you being of Sri Lankan Tamil descent, which makes it also deeply personal.
Sure. Thank you for that question. I think that, of course, being of Sri Lankan Tamil descent makes me very interested in the history, and it gives me a certain kind of access to different kinds of stories. So, for example, community knowledge, community storytelling. I was aided by the generosity of people who had lived through this time period. Many of those people live all over the world, so they form a significant chunk of the diaspora. Many people migrated during that time period. So I was able to speak to people who had lived through essentially the earliest phases of the war. From the book starts its Sri Lankan section in 1981, and it goes through about 1989, and then leaps forward towards the end. And because I was able to speak to people, I was able also to check stories that I had heard that were maybe in some ways incomplete or only partially, just partially complete, things that I wanted to complicate or in some way find more nuance in. So I was able also to deepen the stories that I had heard, to hold up different versions and compare them and see how different perspectives might influence people's understandings of Sri Lankan history, of the history of the conflict. So that was a real privilege. I think that a lot of people took a lot of time and energy to speak with me, which I really appreciate, and which I think a lot of people, it is a painful period. You refer to the book being very emotional, and I think I was interested in what it would feel like to live during that time period. So the book is set mostly in Jaffna, and it centers really on Tamil women and Tamil civilians, Tamil students, students in general. So people whose ordinary civilian lives were disrupted by the conflict and who had to move around it or through it. And I saw people and read about people display a tremendous amount of courage and also lose a lot during that time period. So to write about what that loss was like, and also the ways that people came together through that time period to support each other, specifically in civil society and specifically through collectives of women, was something that was really interesting to me.
I'd like your perspectives on how you bring in this concept of human dignity, which is so inherent and intrinsic to each of us, and how this concept of human dignity is played with, tampered with by state, by other forces, with varying political interests.
Yes, I think I was interested in this particular time period in part because these were some of the earliest years of my conscious life. So some of my earliest memories are of reading about the conflict or seeing scraps of it on television. And it was also a period of the conflict when there were really multiple actors involved in the conflict. So you have, of course, multiple Tamil groups. You have the Indian peacekeeping forces, you have state security forces, you have civil society, you have the international community. And all of those, even the borders and boundaries between those groups are messy and porous, and they are fluid, they shift and change. For example, the Tamil militant groups, there were certain groups, and then some groups were defeated by others, and then new groups were formed. And so throughout Sri Lankan history, you can see political parties and political groups rise and fall, and you can also see that within the conflict. So I was interested in the ways that all of these actors were acting not only on each other, which I think is often the predominant story of the conflict, but really the ways that they were affecting the lives of civilians, the ways that militarization affected civil society, and what it meant to people to live in proximity to that in ways that altered their everydays, altered the natures of their families, their relationships with their closest and dearest loved ones, with their friends, with their teachers, their relationships with space and setting. It's a different thing to go to, if you go to your classroom and in some way one of your classmates is reporting on you to someone else. How does that change the nature of the conversation? How might that change your response? How might you think around or through that? In what ways did people work to keep conversations with each other? So during that period of time, there was a group of university professors, university teachers for human rights, Jaffna, a group of 4 professors who did work to document a lot of what was going on. So I was able to draw very heavily on their work, which was extremely meticulous and careful and thoughtful, and which I admire a great deal, and which is actually, for the most part, really frequently available in university libraries, I think, around the world. Those documents are often there. So I did speak with people, and I did read things that had been published, in and about Sri Lanka. And there's a lot of that material that's actually already on the shelf. It's just not in the form of fiction all the time.
Throughout the course of the book, something that we see is how agency is taken away forcibly from the protagonist and the other characters who we grow to know and love. And also the subjugation, the fear, psychosis that they suffer as a result of what is happening in the country politically. And it's really difficult to read knowing that this book is based on accounts of history of this country.
It is. I have been told that it is a challenging read. And I think also, hopefully, I've also been told by some people that it is a healing thing to read, to see it documented. And so the protagonist you referred to, Sashi, she is the 4th of 5 children. She has 4 brothers, and she has different relationships with all of them. And I did try to make them alive and human and different and quirky, and that they have political opinions that are different from each other. Sometimes those opinions change. Sometimes she tries to change opinions and doesn't succeed, or sometimes she does. So they have arguments and conversations about politics like people do, and also about their futures, which are, of course, necessarily intertwined with the future of politics. The future of politics in any country shapes the future of its people. What possibilities do they have? So this protagonist, as the book starts, she is in her teenage years and she's doing her A-levels, and she wants to become a doctor, right? And that's that's a story that I heard a lot, and it's very common in different parts of Sri Lankan society to have that ambition. And over as I was researching this, I did hear from people who had pursued medical education and other kinds of education during this period, and that's the most ordinary thing to want. Everyone wants to learn things and do something bigger than they're presently doing, or something different, something that's exciting and pleasurable, and such a human thing to want. And the conflict did disrupt that. It meant that medical education for some students, maybe it meant that they began here and finished overseas, or that they finished overseas entirely, or that their medical education was sort of in fits and starts, that there were long pauses where the university was shut down or classes were not held for whatever reason. So the people who tried to keep that educational space and the space for dialogue available are people that I really admire.
Let's also discuss how anger, frustration are key emotions that run throughout the novel. And these are real emotions that real people have also felt going through the conflict and even to date. How do you think your novel Brotherless Night is also a reflection of the real society that we live in today in Sri Lanka?
I think that all of that historical memory is part of present conversation, whether or not there is always the space to acknowledge things that have happened. I think that there is still a significant chunk of the population that lived through the conflict and lived through it, whether in the eastern province or the southern province or the northern province or in Colombo or in Jaffna, what have you. There are a lot of people who know these events. So I guess I was also interested in a story that made people understandable to each other. So I think it's possible that someone might read this book and recognize maybe some part of their own experience, and then hopefully also see an experience maybe that they didn't think about or that wasn't central to their way of living at that time or later, and that they might see how those things are in conversation with each other, that they're part actually of one story. And of course, Brotherless Night is not the only book about this time period. So I think it's also in conversation with, as I mentioned, the University Teachers for Human Rights documents, notably The Broken Palmyra and its sequel, Palmyra Fallen. It's also, of course, in conversation with The Seven Moons of Mali Almeida, which is set very much during the same time period. There are even characters who are references to the same historical figures. So the book is hopefully something that allows people to enter a conversation that will bring them closer, maybe, I hope, to other people in a way that I think literature has always done for me.
All right. We are in conversation with writer V.V. Ganeshananthan. We go in for a short commercial break. We'll be right back.
The People's Platform.
Autovision, Saturday, 7:30 p.m.
Miss Pooja, Miss Kete me kade. Idol Miss
Pooja Raghu.
Sorry madam, me වෙලාවේ මට පොඩ්ඩක් අඳුර ගන්න බැරුණා. අර අපේ ගොල්ලෙක් තමයි කිව්වේ madam අවලා කියලා. මම ආසයි madam එක්ක වැඩ කරන්න.
තවමත් මගේ දෛවය මට නපුරු. අතීතයේ අඳුරු හිමිනලි තාමත් මගේ ජීවිතය අහුමුළු වල තියෙනවා.
ඔයාව කියන තරම් එයාව අන්දන්න රවට්ටන්න ලේසි නෑ. වෙලාවක ඔයාව ඔෆිස් එකෙන් එලවලා දාන්න බැරි.
ඔයා වරදක් කළාද නැද්ද කියලා මම හිතුවට වැඩක් නෑ. තමන් වරදක් කළාද නැද්ද කියන එක තමන්ට හිතෙන්න.
නීල පබලු අද රාත්‍රී 9ට සිරස ටෙලිතිරයෙන්. TV1 TV for life.
India's UPI payment services launched in Sri Lanka and Mauritius. Multiple factions warn of attempts to delay Sri Lankan elections. No other leader can be compared to Ranil, a statement from UNP's Vajra. multiple amendments to the Online Safety Act, less than a fortnight since it was passed. Health trade unions to go on strike again tomorrow. More than 60 killed in strikes on Gaza's Rafah.
TV1. TV for life. The People's Platform.
Welcome back. We're in conversation with writer V.V. Ganeshananthan. I'd like you to start this half of the conversation with an excerpt from Brotherless Night.
Sure, thank you. I'd be happy to do that. This is from fairly deep into the book, about halfway. And the protagonist, Sashi, is remembering an interaction that she had with her brother, who is in the movement. She sometimes sees him even so. And she's thinking about a book that they had both read, a Tamil novel, and the ways that he helped her to read and to study. And I'll add any other context as I'm reading. I would have given him my copy of the book then, but I was still in the middle myself. I would have liked that, the idea of him reading something I had given him in one place while I read by the light he had given me in another. So I'll just stop here and say that there is not always current at this time. So one of the difficulties people were sometimes facing simply was doing their schoolwork, and her brother had given her a bottle of kerosene, a little bit of contraband. I used the kerosene until it ran out and never told anyone where I got it. The salt lamp he had taught me to make gave only enough light for a paragraph, so I moved it block by block down the pages with painstaking care. From the mantel, the Polaire chess piece my grandmother had left behind presided over my work. By the time I drained the bottle of kerosene's precious dregs, the medical school students had figured out a new habit. We stood under the street lamps outside the Jaffna Teaching Hospital to study. The area around there had been designated a safety zone to preserve it from aerial attack, and the lamps had tube bulbs that faced the sky and emanated a precious and unnatural brightness. Every night, 100 or so people would cycle with their books to crowd under those lamps until they went out. Those jostling for space ranged from year 5 children aiming for scholarships to my batchmates. One night I stayed particularly late preparing for another exam. As I packed up my belongings, I saw across the street a tall and solid and recognizable silhouette reminiscent of Appa's. Was it? I lifted a tentative hand. My brother raised one back. Inwardly, I cheered. He had guessed or known that I would be there. An idea seized me. I had just finished the book he had given me, which I could pass back to him as he had handed so many books to me and as we had always read together. What would we say to each other when he had finished it? Swinging my bag onto my shoulder and hurrying onto my bicycle, I passed across the light's threshold into the dark. I could see him in the shadows just ahead. "Dialanana," I called out. "Wait." But the figure I had thought was him began to bleed into the night, its edges becoming less and less discernible. Before I could reach him, he was gone. There was no proof that anyone had seen me, or that I had seen anyone. I was left with only the echo of togetherness, my own sure feeling that he had come.
That was beautiful, thank you. From this, I'd like to ask you for your perspectives on how education, which is such a powerful tool to transform lives, is and has been throughout history across borders been used to divide, subjugate people, and to keep people ignorant and desensitized to realities. For example, history education in Sri Lanka isn't the most comprehensive, and to heal after a conflict, Sri Lankans need to know about what happened in the past in a bid to not repeat mistakes from the past. As an educator yourself, you're an associate professor at the University of Minnesota. Speak to us about how we can overcome these deep-rooted, damaging inequalities in education. How do you view this?
When I think about this now, it's impossible for me not to consider, of course, my own home context, the United States, where education, specifically public education, is very much under attack by various interests. And you do see, exactly what you're describing, people who would prefer, for example, to not address the history of enslavement in the United States, the histories of Black Americans, the history of American Indians, the history really of genocide in the United States, which is it's a foundational part of the founding of the United States. So, and yet how we talk about it, how we think about it, the language that we put to it, it's constantly being contested. So right now, book bans in the United States are increasing. You see them very much in particular states. This happens a lot in Florida. You see also queer texts being challenged. You see people trying to take books out of other people's hands, really. And so this happens with school libraries. It also, to some extent, happens with public libraries. So sometimes when I think about what can I do about something like that, actually the example I look to is sometimes Sri Lanka, where you see civil society groups. For example, in the book, there is a feminist book club that meets, and students read a text in common and talk about it. And they're not actually doing it in a class. They're doing it kind of in a tradition of educating themselves, taking responsibility for that themselves, because they want to know, they want to learn, they want to debate ideas with each other. So how can I look to that model, which so many people I know have used and benefited from, not only in Sri Lankan communities, but I think, right, there's a strong tradition of this kind of education in Black communities in the United States, right? The communities where education has been compromised or denied in some way, diminished, those communities have often come up with their own systems of community education. So what lessons can I learn from that? And I think particularly now that people want the curriculum to be limited in a certain way, or to put forth a certain kind of narrative and not allow room for argument, where can we create room for those arguments, for the nuance, if it's not going to be in schools?
There is often a danger that it is always the dominant narrative that is sort of perpetuated, which leads to a very exclusionary way of going about things across the board. And education can't function in a vacuum. It has to take into account the socio-economic, socio-political, cultural, religious, linguistic diversity, and be inclusive.
Yes.
How far away do you think we are from achieving that?
Insularity is not educationally advantageous or culturally advantageous particularly. And here I think there is some work to do in that regard. And, language parity is one example of a way in which, in what ways can people be in conversation with each other when they don't always have language in common? And I was just speaking to someone earlier today who told me that he was about to start Tamil lessons. And I thought, that's so exciting. What a great step to take. So I I do hear about people who are thinking about, how can I learn English? How can I learn Sinhala? How can I learn Tamil? How can I be in conversation with more people? How can I engage rigorously with my own community and also with others?
The arts are a way of people processing their traumas, and we see this throughout the Sri Lankan community, the Sri Lankan Tamil diaspora community as well. But art must be used as a bridge builder as opposed to being a divider. But it's not simplistic. It's a very complex thing. You can't just order people how to make art. But also, it's important for art to bring people together as opposed to dividing people, because we've seen enough division. How do you view this?
I think that art in general is good at complicating conversation because answers are not always required. It's a space in which people can be uncertain or can allow more than one answer to coexist. So, I mean, this novel is almost 400 pages long. It has lots of things in it that reflect a lot of different experiences. So there's space for different narratives to run parallel to each other, to intersect. And I think fiction in particular, or at least the fiction that I'm interested in, right? I'm interested in what did it feel like? What were people's minds like? What were people's consciousnesses like? And I do think actually that that's something that fiction can approach. So I can actually imagine other people. And it's interesting and joyful, actually, often to do that, right? I mean, art is a way of processing trauma. It's also a way of expressing joy or solidarity. And archiving beauty or observing it. So it's a way of paying attention to the world also. So it's a way of paying attention to other people, learning to read them better, more carefully, with more faith and fewer assumptions.
And finally, the concept of identity and belonging. Where is home if I have to constantly be looking over my shoulder, where I feel like I don't belong?
Well, I'm a diasporic person, so the question of home is, I think, always very complicated for me, even within the context of the United States. I have lived in so many different states, and I actually consider virtually every state that I lived in to be a kind of home for me. And I also feel to some degree that when I come here, I am coming home, because there are varieties of understanding and experience that I can find here that resonate with my own that I can't find anywhere else. So belonging can take a lot of different shapes and forms. It can move in different ways, and there are also ways that we can extend it to each other. And I do think that one of the ways that people can do that is by reading.
V.V. Ganeshananthan, thank you so much for immersing yourself in a work that is so deeply personal as it is painful. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me on the show. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for watching us. We'll see you again tomorrow. Good night.